Hello, this is WASSCE Tutoring by Terence P. I have started a new journey. That is, I want to exploit a particular group of organisms known as the chordates. Specifically, I want to discuss about the birds and the mammals. This is part 1 of a series of videos that I'm doing that will focus on birds. The objectives for today's video are brief overview of the animal kingdom, characteristics of chordates, birds or the class aves. Here there will be a comprehensive overview of this particular class of organism, and lastly there will be discussion of WASSCE related questions that is related to the topic under discussion. As an introduction, all animals according to biological classification scheme fall under the kingdom Animalia. That is, all of the animals that you as a student know up to date, these animals fall under a particular kingdom called Kingdom Animalia. Allow me to briefly take your mind back to 10th grade, wherein you study the classification of organisms. There is the traditional classification of organisms wherein an organism is placed in a kingdom, the organism is placed in a phylum, the organism is placed in a class, and so on down the series. This is what basically is being talked about here, wherein animals are placed in the kingdom Animalia. Also, the kingdom Animalia can be further broken down into the phylum called Chordata. Now, the organisms in the phylum Chordata are referred to as chordates. These organisms are referred to as chordates on grounds that they possess a notochord. The notochord is an embryonic structure in a representative chordate. They use we human beings as case study or our representative organism here. During the embryonic development or the embryonic developmental stages of a human being, there is the presence of a notochord. In adulthood, this notochord will not persist. That is, this notochord will differentiate into something else, and that thing is known as the vertebral column, also known as the backbone, a flexible skeleton. The phylum Chordata can be further subdivided into 3 subphyla. And these 3 subphyla are the phylum Vertebrata, the subphylum Vertebrata, the subphylum Chordata, and the subphylum Cephalochordata. At the end, there should be A and not E. Before moving on to the next slide, there's a need to talk a little bit of the group of organisms that are referred to as animals. You might just be asked, what is an animal? It is a question that might just sound simple, at times it is complicated when you don't know the required biological jargons to use. Firstly, animals are eukaryotic organisms. The next thing is that these eukaryotic organisms are heterotrophic. And lastly, they are capable of movement, that is, movement in the form of locomotion, moving from one place to another. Or simple definition of animals would be, animals are eukaryotic heterotrophs that are characterized by locomotion. An example of an animal would be the bird that we are going to be discussing in this particular video. Now, this is the basic overview of animal classification. Like I started saying previously, animals are firstly classified by placing the animal into a kingdom, a phylum, a class, an order, a family, or genus, and lastly a species. Since we are talking about the birds, firstly the birds are going to be placed in the kingdom Animalia. And then next is going to be placed in the phylum Chordata, since birds are chordates. Now, while discussing the phylum, there are several phyla. The plural for phylum is phyla. There are several phyla in which animals are placed. A lot of these phyla constitute the organisms that are referred to as the invertebrates. The invertebrates, these are organisms that do not possess a vertebral column, or they do not possess backbone. A very small percentage of organisms are placed or are considered as the vertebrates. Now, in the phylum Chordata, there are 3 subphyla. The last 2 subphyla here consist also of invertebrates. The subphylum Chordata consists of invertebrates, and the subphylum Chordata consists of invertebrates. The subphylum of the vertebrates is known as vertebrata. The vertebrates. These are organisms that have the vertebral column or the backbone. Organisms that are found within this particular subphylum are referred to as the vertebrates. That is the subphylum vertebrata. There are several classes to this particular subphylum. And there's a very broad class that is known as the class of the phages. The class of the phages can further be classified into the jawless phages and the jaw phages. Examples of jawless phages are the hark phages and the lampreys. The jaw phages are the phages that we are mostly familiar with. And the jaw phages are divided broadly into 2 groups: the bony phages, for example, snapper or the tilapia. The cartilaginous phages, on the other hand, an example of them would be the sharks, and another example would be the rays. The bony phages, these are phages that have their skeleton made of bones, which is a tissue, a type of tissue. And the cartilaginous phages, these are phages that have their skeleton made of cartilages. The next class under the subphylum vertebrata is the class Amphibia. And it is in this class you can find organisms known as the amphibians. A representative example would be the frog. Next is the class Reptilia, where you can find the reptile. This is the class of the lizards. The class aves, which is our class of focus, is the class of the birds. These are organisms that are characterized by the possession of feathers. This is their major distinguishing feature. That is the feature that will distinguish the birds from all other living animals. And lastly, the class Mammalia. That is the class of we human beings. If you can see or note to the left of this particular slide, the lower left of the particular slide that is here, you have the term ectothermic and you have the term endothermic. The organisms in the class of the fishes, the class of the amphibians, and the class of the reptiles are ectothermic, or these organisms are ectoderms. These organisms are organisms that do not have a constant body temperature. Their environment influences their body temperature. On the other hand, the endothermic organism or the endotherms, these are organisms that have constant body temperature. Like we humans, you'll notice that we have our constant body temperature ranging from 36.6 to 37.6, just in a particular range. With this being said, let's move on to the next slide. This slide presents to us the hallmarks of the chordates. And the hallmark of the chordates are a notochord, pharyngeal slits, also known as pharyngeal pouches. Some literature will consider the pharyngeal slits as pharyngeal pouches. The tubular nerve core, and lastly, number 4 is the post-anal tail, or just simply the tail. Now, the notochord is a supportive rod that extends most of the length of the animal. Next is the pharyngeal slits or the pharyngeal pouches. These are a series of openings between the digestive tract of the organism and the outside of the body. Next is the tubular nerve core that lies just above the notochord and expands anteriorly into our brain. In higher chordate, it is this tubular nerve cord that is known as the spinal cord, and the notochord will be known as the vertebral column. And lastly, the post-anal tail, or simply the tail, that extends posteriorly to the anus and supported by the notochord, the vertebral column. This slide presents to us a representative chordate showing all of the chordate hallmarks. If there is a representative chordate anteriorly in this chordate, you will see what will differentiate into the brain of the organism. And then from the brain running posteriorly is what is known as the hollow nerve core. So you have the brain, and then running posteriorly is the hollow nerve core. Or we can also say that the hollow nerve core is running from posterior to anterior, wherein it will expand into the brain of the organism. Below the hollow nerve core is the notochord. And here you have what is known as the pharyngeal slits or the pharyngeal pouches. If you can remember the next slide, the slide before this particular slide talk about, this actually these are pouches that are between the digestive tract of the organism and the outside of the body. And you will know that the digestive tract of the organism normally starts with the mouth of the organism and ends with the anus. So you have the pharyngeal pouches here. Now, the last thing or the last characteristic is the post-anal tail, or simply the tail that is behind the anus or posterior to the anus of the organism. I will advise that you take a notebook and copy this particular diagram and try to know it. Next, the vertebrate animals, also known as the craniates, because they have what is known as the cranium, a particular casing for the skull of a particular casing for the brain of the organism. The craniates, these are a type of classification or classified organism that possess the cranium. And the cranium is a casing or a protective covering over the brain of these organisms. Like we said, these organisms are characterized by flexible endoskeleton, or we have now the flexible endoskeleton here that is being talked about can be either made of bone or it can be made of cartilage, like was mentioned in the previous slide. However, in the case of the aves, these are organisms that possess strictly an endoskeleton made of bones. Now, the reason you are seeing endoskeleton here is because in a discussion of the types of skeleton in animals, there are basically three types of skeletons. You have what is referred to as the hydrostatic skeleton, the exoskeleton, and the endoskeleton. Now, the endoskeleton is a skeleton that is formed within the body of the organism. If you have interacted with a bird before, you will notice that the skeleton or the bones of the organism are formed within the organism, that is below the skin of the organism. The five classes of the vertebrates are the fishes, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals. Now let's look at the birds, starting our conversation with the class aves. The birds are vertebrates of the class aves. The evolution of flight and of endothermy, or warm-bloodedness, has enabled birds to survive virtually every known environment. There are two things on this slide that students are required to take note of. Birds are capable of flight, and birds are warm-blooded organisms, that is, endothermic organisms. When saying birds are capable of flight, this doesn't imply that all birds can fly, but the evolution of flight is mostly seen in the birds. There are certain birds that are considered as flight birds, and there are certain birds that are considered non-flight birds. However, there's a need to know that flight is mostly associated with birds. Although there are some other organisms that can fly, or some other animals, or some other vertebrates that can fly. For example, the bats, which are mammals. These mammals are capable of flight. Let's take a closer look at the diagram on the right here. You will notice that the bird, the skeleton of the bird is highlighted. And the skeleton of the bird that is highlighted here is made up of bones that are hollow, meaning that bones that have space in them. As you can see right here, this is the internal aspect of the hollow bone of a bird. There's a need to note that the entire skeleton of the bird is light-weighted, that is capable of ensuring that the bird is capable of flight. Several parts of the bird skeleton are the skull, the vertebral column, the pelvic girdle, the collarbone, the pectoral girdle, the sternum, also known as the breastbone, and the rib cage. And the skeleton constitutes an internal feature of the bird. External features of the bird is the presence of wings, the presence of a tail, and both the wings and the tail are consisting of feathers. Now, let's talk about the characteristics of a bird. When we say the characteristic of a bird, we are talking about those things that will set the bird apart from other animals. Although there are some things that a bird will share with other animals, however, there are some things that are specific to the bird. For example, the presence of a toothless beak. Toothless beak is a distinguishing feature of birds, or toothless horned beak. Another thing is the body of the bird is covered with feathers. It is only birds that have feathers. Let's go through the characteristics in an orderly manner. Characteristic number 1 is the bodies are covered with feathers. The bones of the bird are thin and hollow, like we saw here. This is the inner aspect of the bone of the bird. The inner aspect of the bone of the bird. It is thin and hollow. This enables the bird to fly. The wings of the bird are adapted for flight. The birds have claw toes, as you can see here, right here, the claw toes of the bird. The birds are warm-blooded, or they are endothermic, having a temperature ranging from 38 degrees Celsius to 40 degrees Celsius. The birds have a constant body temperature that is maintained by panting. And panting is a particular phenomenon where you'll notice the bird is breathing faster and the bird heart is pumping at a greater pace than some other organism. This is panting, and panting ensures that a constant body temperature is maintained within the birds. Birds are oviparous. Oviparity is a phenomenon that talks about the organism is able to lay egg outside of their body, and the eggs are incubated and then they will be hatched outside the body of the organism. So birds are oviparous and they exhibit what is termed as oviparity. Birds carry on internal fertilization. Fertilization being mentioned here can be defined as the fusion of an egg or an ovum and a sperm cell. Now, this particular process can either be in the body of the organism or outside the body of the organism. When saying outside the body of the organism, we're mostly in a watery environment. Internal fertilization happens in the birds and they lay hard-shell egg, making them to be oviparous. Birds have 4-chamber heart. 4-chamber heart, as in the case of humans. Human beings have 4-chamber hearts, and birds also have 4-chamber heart. 4-chamber heart, where you have the upper chambers and the lower chamber. The upper chambers are referred to as the atria, and the lower chambers are referred to as the ventricles. Most species of birds will lay eggs, and the eggs are incubated within a nest. So basically, these are the characteristics of the birds, and I think it is all of what will be discussed in this particular video in relation to the bird. In part 2 of this particular video, we'll talk about the internal characteristics of the bird, external characteristics of the bird, classification of the bird, so on and so forth. Let's now look at discussion of WASSCE related questions as it relates to the particular topic, or what has been discussed here. There are not many questions that you have from particularly the introduction to the bird, talking about the chordates, characteristic of chordata. Not many questions will appear on the WASSCE exam from a particular area. An area to take note of is the characteristics of the bird. There's a need that you know at least 8 characteristics of the birds. Now let's move on to the questions that are here. The question 1 reads, an animal that relies on interaction with the environment to help it control body temperature is known as. This is something that we have discussed together and I think you can answer. And that is, the answer here will be endotherm. Organisms that rely on the interaction with the environment to help, it's not endotherm. Organisms that will rely on the interaction of the environment to help control body temperature will be ectotherm, like the raptors, the amphibians, and the fishes. They'll depend on the environment to control their body temperature. Those ones that will not depend on the environment but have constant body temperature will be the endotherm. The flatbirds are just a term used to classify birds. Flightless birds are just a term used to classify organisms, certain species of birds that do not fly. And endoderm is one of the 3 germ layers, that is, the embryonic germ layer or the germ layer that the different body parts will come from. One of them is the endoderm. Question number 2 reads, the single most important characteristic that separates birds from other living animals is the presence of, this is something that is tricky. Somebody want to take wings and somebody want to take feathers. But the correct answer to this question here is feather. Reason being is that organisms like the bats that was mentioned in this particular video have wings, but their wings do not have feathers. So the single most important characteristic that will separate birds from other living organisms will be feathers. It is true that hollow bones is a characteristic of a bird. 2 legs is also a characteristic of a bird. Wings is also a characteristic of a bird. But it should be noted that the most important distinguishing feature is the presence of feathers. Please, like I said, try to know at least 8 of these characteristics because there's a possibility that they might just appear on the exam. These are the references for this particular video, and most of the images in this video came from Prentice Hall Biology. Thanks for watching. I will encourage you to share this particular video with your friends who are also preparing for WASSCE exam. For questions and inquiries, you can contact the numbers and the email address. My name is Terrence P, and please don't forget to subscribe to this particular channel. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and always like the videos that are posted. Thank you very much again.